Welcome everybody to the 28th Virtual History of 2021 presented by the Baltimore Architecture Foundation and Baltimore Heritage. My name is Molly Ricks and I'm with Baltimore Heritage. And thank you to everyone who donated to be with us here today. Your support allows us to host these more virtual histories, and we'll keep doing it in September. So just so you guys know, this is the last presentation before we take a summer break. So we'll be back in September with more histories. And thank you again. So for today's presentation, Nathan Dennies will be telling the story of Woodberry through its development over the past 200 years. Nathan is the Associate Director at the Baltimore Architecture Foundation. And Nathan fell in love with the Jones Falls Valley when he first moved to Woodberry 9 years ago and has obsessed over its history ever since. He formed the Greater Hampden Heritage Alliance with fellow enthusiasts to draw attention to the area's rich history. Nathan's work has won awards from Baltimore Heritage, most recently for a series of Wayfinding Signs at historic sites completed for Preservation Maryland with his friend and talented designer, Paula Boger, and done in collaboration with Baltimore Heritage and the BAF. Nathan currently lives in Mount Washington, and that's where he joins us from today. If you have any...
Yeah, I'm still living in the Jones Falls Valley. I will just continually live here for the rest of my life. So thank you for that introduction, and I'm so happy to be able to present this presentation today. Before I get started, I just have a few special thanks. First, a major thank you to Jennifer Gould, Julie Darcy, and Betty Bird. They did the incredible research and documentation for the Woodberry National Register nomination. It's incredibly comprehensive and really is the basis for a lot of this presentation. Also, thank you to John McGrain. John's work researching the textile mills in the Jones Falls Valley has been so invaluable to so much of the research I've done. And also thank yous to the BMI, the Pratt Library, UMBC, and the Hopkins Sheridan Libraries for enabling me to have access to those archives, and a lot of the images you'll see here are from those archives. And also thank you to Baltimore Heritage, Preservation Maryland, Greater Hampden Heritage Alliance, and BAF for supporting me in all this work. And finally, a big thank you to CHAP staff and Woodbury Community Association for all of the incredible work on the Woodberry Local Historic District. So we'll begin our story in 1798. And in 1798, there are approximately 10 flour mills located in proximity to the Jones Falls. And at this point in Baltimore's history, flour trade is the big game in town. And it makes a lot of people, merchants, rich in the city, one of whom, one of the most successful businessmen was Elisha Tyson, pictured here. He had 2 flour mills located near Woodberry, one actually in Woodberry and one at the site of what's Mill number 1 today. And pictured here also is what was his summer house, which is located in what is Stone Hill today. We're going to fast forward a few decades. America now has a very established textile mill industry. You think of Lowell, Massachusetts. Well, Baltimore's Lowell is Woodberry. And what you start to see around this time are industrialists are buying up the old flour mills, tearing them down, and building larger textile mills on these sites. One pair of industrialists was David Carroll and Horatio Gambrel. And what they did was establish the Woodberry factory right here in Woodberry. And these were large factories, and they were designed to be as efficient as possible. You see all of these windows here and this large clear story on top to maximize daylight. So you could have lots of workers in there. And also one of the defining features of this is this bell tower here. So the workers would have been living right across, so here's the mill here, they would have been living right across from the mill, right across the train tracks. And so that bell tower would have signaled the beginnings and endings of their shifts. And the mill owners required a large workforce to operate their large textile mill. And so they also had to build the homes for the workers and also establish all the amenities for their workforce, who they were recruiting from rural Maryland and Pennsylvania, and later from Appalachia. And so here's an example of one of the original homes in Woodberry, built in the 1840s alongside the textile mill. And these were done in a Gothic revival style that has like this sort of country cottage type feel to it. And this was very intentional on the part of the mill owners, because Americans at this time heard horror stories of the factory towns and cities in Britain. And they knew that like that was something that was not going to work in America. And so they really set out to create a more bucolic atmosphere, also including yard space for things like raising livestock, growing vegetables, which you still see in Woodberry today, growing flowers. And these homes today are very desired because of their historic value, but at the time, you'd have large families living in these houses that were quite small, of like 10 to 12 people, and they would often have to take boarders because they weren't making enough money at the mills to make a living. The mill owners provided all of the amenities in the neighborhood. One of the big ones, of course, was the neighborhood church. So here is an image of the Woodberry Methodist Episcopal Church. The mill owners were primarily Methodist, so of course they developed Methodist churches. There was a church on this site, probably dating from around the time the mill village was built in the 1840s. That was later torn down and rebuilt in 1867. Also built of this characteristic dark stone called Baltimore gneiss. So just like the duplexes, it's built of this stone that was quarried along the Jones Falls. And this church was designed by an architect by the name of John Hogg. And moving on, this is at the railroad tracks, and you see the Woodberry factory in the background. And up front here is the all-purpose general store / post office / meeting hall for the neighborhood. And here is a view of Woodberry from the mid-19th century. It really gives you an idea of what early Woodberry looked like. So in the front here is Union Avenue, which travels across the Jones Falls here. And you turn in, and here is Woodberry's original mill village. In the background here is the mill owner's mansion. And so these villages are really designed in a sort of paternalistic fashion, where the mill owner had like the big mansion on the hill overlooking his domain. And then if you come back further down, you'll see the beginnings of the Poole and Hunt machine shop and ironworks. And Robert Poole was an immigrant from what is now Northern Ireland. He came to Baltimore and apprenticed in different machine shops around town, and eventually established his own shop, which burned, and then he moved and expanded to Woodberry in the 1850s. And this is a lithograph print from the late 19th century. You see that it's situated right alongside the railroad, and there's even a railroad spur that goes into the factory grounds. And this campus expanded over time as the company grew and as they took on more complex and different types of commissions. One good example of that is this erecting shop back here, which was built in 1890 and had an 80-foot clearance for building really massive machines. They were primarily working for the railroad industry, but they were also providing machines for all different types of industrial purposes. One is for the textile mill industry. So it was a shrewd business decision for Robert Poole to situate his factory close to the textile mills. And so here is an ad for a double turbine water wheel. And next to it is supposedly a loom that was built on site. Poole was perhaps most famous for constructing the columns of the peristyle of the Capitol building dome, which you see here, and also the machines that made the construction possible, such as the cranes and derricks. He also provided the funds for Hampden's library, Enoch Pratt Library Branch 7, and provided the columns for the library as well. The library recently reopened after going through some renovations. It's beautiful. I recommend checking it out if you live in Hampden. And another thing that Robert Poole contributed greatly to was the development of Brick Hill. And so Brick Hill is located adjacent to the factory. largely constructed in the 1850s and would have provided housing for workers working at Poole and Hunt, and also later on for workers at the textile mills as well. And these houses, being called Brick Hill, were constructed of brick rather than that locally quarried Baltimore gneiss. And one of the great things about Brick Hill too is that it feels somewhat secluded from the rest of Woodberry. You have to go up a steep hill to get to it, and it backs up right against Druid Hill Park, which is a really nice setting. And across the tracks from Brick Hill, Meadow Mill was constructed in 1877. And this was designed by an architect by the name of Reuben Gladfelter. He was the company's go-to man for designing their buildings. And this was really designed to be a showpiece for the mills. The 1870s through the end of the 19th century were really major boom years for the textile mills. And so this was really a demonstration of the prosperity of the company. You see this very nice looking bell tower here, and also they had landscape grounds in front of the mill, and this was facing the light rail track. Next to it is this really interesting insurance map that shows the site plan of the mill, and I wish I could zoom in on some of this stuff, but it shows you just how the mills were designed to be as efficient as possible, and the separation of different types of processes in the manufacturing of textiles. Meadow Mill was manufacturing twine, and Woodberry factory, which we talked about earlier, was manufacturing cotton duck. And cotton duck is this water-resistant, heavy-duty canvas that was primarily used for ship sails in the 19th century. And you see here that that Woodberry factory has expanded. And so as technologies changed and as the factory grew, new buildings were added. So in the late 1840s, when steam power was introduced, they had to build a boiler house. And then also later in that decade, they built Park Mill. And Park Mill was built for the construction of fishing nets. So we move into the later part of the century, 1870s and 1880s. And this was a major boom time for the neighborhood. So there's a direct connection between the growth of these factories and the growth of the neighborhood. As the factories grow, they need more workers, and so more workers are moving into the neighborhood. And one of the interesting stats of this time is that between 1870 and 1880, the population of Woodberry grew from around 600 people to nearly 3,000, becoming the largest industrial town outside of Baltimore. And the Sun at the time had described Woodberry as becoming a city within itself. So here is a view of Woodberry and the church. And then here is a view looking out towards Hampden. And at this point in time, Hampden was really considered part of Woodberry. So all these houses here were part of a mill housing development for Druid Mill, which is called Union Mill today and has Artifact Coffee. You also see back here Robert Poole's mansion on top of the hill. And looking further back into the background, you see the steeple of St. Thomas Aquinas Church. So here is a map from the 1870s, and you see the development of Woodberry going down Woodberry Lane, which becomes Druid Park Drive and is really the main drag of Woodberry. And what's interesting about this time is that the mill companies are no longer building the housing for the workers. They were builders and developers who were stepping in to fill that role. And one of the companies was called the Woodberry Land Trust. And so they bought up, you see their name down here. They were buying up a lot of land in the neighborhood. And here are some examples of houses that were built between the 1860s and 70s. Tended to be like these wood frame vernacular homes on 2 stories or duplexes or single family. And then you also start to see some row house infall as well as the decades move along. And this is one of my my favorite rows in Woodberry on Rockrose Avenue. I really like these row houses with the window details and the nice cornices and the corbelled brick. And so we enter into the 1890s, and you see that Woodberry is continuing to expand down Woodberry Avenue / Druid Park Drive. And around this time, you also see more services and tradespeople moving into the neighborhood. There's a general store that gets established here at the corner by the Barton brothers, and they're providing groceries, provisions, dry goods, etc., to the neighborhood. Also, a census from the period shows that you had a shoemaker living in the neighborhood, cigar makers, a physician, a barber, a paper maker, and a baker. So you're seeing a diversity of different trades coming into the neighborhood as the neighborhood grows. And one of the curious things that happens at this time too, so Woodberry is annexed by Baltimore along with Hampden in 1888. And around this time, you see development shifting away from Woodberry into Hampden. So Hampden becomes the hotspot to live in. And so development really starts to slow in Woodberry as people are moving up the hill to Hampden. And the avenue becomes a staple of that neighborhood. And I mean, I'm sure there's a myriad of factors as to why that happened. I think maybe one of the primary ones was that people no longer wanted to live so close to the factories where they worked. I mean, the amount of pollution you probably see with the Poole and Hunt foundry and machine shop and the cotton factories, it's probably made it a very noisy and sort of polluted place to live. So it felt better to move up the hill and be sort of distant from that, but also, within walking distance. And also by the turn of the century, the Mount Vernon Company becomes this massive corporation. So all the mills in the Jones Falls Valley band together to form this single company, and also some mills out of states, which is in the Carolinas. And the Mount Vernon Company controls the majority of the world's cotton duck production at this point in time. It becomes very prosperous. However, that prosperity does not reach the workers who spend every day of their lives working in these mills. So according to the 1900 census, only 20 out of 150 families in Woodberry own their homes. And the ones who did own their homes tend to be skilled laborers, and also were probably workers at the Poole and Hunt machine shop and foundry. They simply didn't make enough money to make ends meet. And one of the realities too of working in the mills was that when production slowed, they would shut down the mills for months at a time, leaving people out of work. And it also was difficult for workers to organize and strike if they were renting from company houses, because that would be grounds for eviction. There was a strong labor movement in Woodberry, though, including successfully fighting for lower hours and higher wages. Poole and Hunt is also booming at this time. They made it under the cover of Scientific American with this 65-foot diameter sand wheel for the Calumet and Hecla Mining Company. And they also get into the new and innovative cable car industry and start manufacturing these cable car plants. Really the last hurrah, I think, for the textile mill industry in the Jones Falls Valley was the construction of Hooperwood Mill in 1905. So the Hooper family decides to break away from the massive corporation and build their own mill along Parkdale. And so this is just behind the Poole and Hunt complex. It's all electric power. And they started manufacturing different types of cotton duck. One of them is this advertisement you see here called Fire Chief, which was a type of cotton duck that was laced with asbestos. They do see some boom time during the wars. So making tents for the army was something that the mills were doing. And also Poole and Hunt were manufacturing components for these guns on US destroyer ships. However, by the 1920s, you start seeing a lot of these mills being sold off to different manufacturing operations. So Frank Schenuit and his rubber company buy the old Woodberry factory, and they start manufacturing rubber tires for trucks there. Sadly, the factory burns down in 1929, and the Schenuit rubber factory building that was there, sadly until it was demolished this year, was in its place. And Schenuit went on to manufacture tires for aircraft during World War II. An ice cream cone factory called Best Cone moves into Park Mill, along with the Commercial Envelope Company. During the Great Depression, Poole and Hunt falls into very hard times and has to sell off much of its property. So the Franklin Balmar Company moves in. They are also providing a lot of materials for the railroad industry. And in the Second World War, end up getting into aerospace and manufacturing airplane components. They are also involved in manufacturing components for the Manhattan Project. Meadow Mill tries to hold on in the 20th century. They start experimenting with manufacturing synthetic fibers, and this requires them to board up all of the windows in the mill. This doesn't last for very long, and in 1960, London fog comes to town and takes over the factory. And London fog becomes one of the most successful men's raincoat operations in the country, perhaps the world at the time of the 1960s and 70s. And they employed around 1,500 people in Baltimore, 600 of whom were working at Meadow Mill. But that's still in context of the size and scale of the textile mill operation. In Baltimore, there were probably around 4,000 people working in the textile mills. So we're moving back to the residential development of Woodberry. And in the 20th century, development isn't as rapid as it is the previous century, but you still see some significant development happening. And so between 1910 and the end of the 1950s, 17 new rows of houses are constructed in Woodberry. You see here circled on this map from 1914, this intersection of Keyworth and Woodberry, and these are the types of row houses you see there. And so the row house trends of Woodberry were also reflecting the trends we're seeing elsewhere in the city. So this Renaissance revival style row house with these bay windows on the second floor start popping up. Move on to the 1920s, and the daylight style row house becomes the new trend. And so this is an area that's around Parkdale and Girard Avenue. And these houses are, what sets them apart are these interesting Spanish tile style roofs. And these are actually not made out of terracotta, they're metal. And then in the 1940s, you see wartime housing being built, and in particular along Druid Park Drive next to the church. So these are like even more modest version of the 1920s houses that we saw. They had like either asphalt or asbestos roofs originally. I actually lived in one of these houses for a couple years. Wasn't bad. They're nice houses. And one of the interesting things too about the 1940s is that Woodberry is still seen as this sort of like old-timey anomaly. I can pull up this quote here from the Baltimore Sun. They had an article in 1940 called "Woodberry, the Picturesque Old Mill Town of the Hills. The last century in its sweep across Baltimore appears to have missed this deep, narrow, winding stream valley." So there was this sense that like Woodberry has still maintained its 19th century mill town character. And a lot of these row houses that we've been talking about too still provided space for say growing vegetables. So you still kind of front and backyards with a lot of these houses. And so moving on to the next major phase in Woodberry, which is the establishment of TV Hill. I read a funny article a while back about how before TV Hill came to be, there was a resident of Woodberry who would graze cattle up on TV Hill. It just goes to show the sort of environment that Woodberry was. And one of my favorite buildings of this period, we're talking about the 1960s now, is the WJZ TV studio, which was designed by a Turkish architect by the name of Nezahat Erikoglu. Built in 1965, she was working for the Whiting Turner Company. And you see this is very much of the style of that period, that international style. And one of the most significant additions to the neighborhood was the television tower. So all of the TV stations in the area banded together to get this thing built to improve and expand the television signal. And one of the things that I really liked about living in Woodberry is that you could never be lost wherever you were in Baltimore. You just had to walk towards the candelabra and you find your way home. And we're moving now into the present day. And in the 1990s, the light rail arrives and follows the old Northern Central Railroad line. And a light rail stop is built at Woodberry. And sadly, also in the 1990s, the Poole and Hunt complex burns down on the south side. In the 90s, the Poole and Hunt complex had become this great haven for artists. And there were lots of artist studios in the old machine shop there and in that complex that sadly lost a lot of their work. A firefighter died in the fire. There's also a rock gym in the old erecting shop. So the erecting shop and the machine shop suffered devastating fires. And years later, Shiver Brother, Eccles, and Rouse come in to redevelop the site with architects Chobe and Holbeck. And they do this amazing adaptive use project you see here, reusing the existing historic buildings and converting them to new uses, such as office space. And you also see the new condo building that they built here, which is in line with the form and character and shape of the old machine shop that was there. And one of the most inventive projects they do is to turn the skeleton of that erecting shop into a really cool apartment building. And another great thing about this too is that you see the legacy of manufacturing and making carried on into the present day. So Gutierrez Studios, which is a metalworking shop, and they create incredible architectural elements for buildings around the city, and also incredible furniture. They're carrying on the metalworking traditions of Poole and Hunt. There's a glass blowing studio on that complex, and also these great manufacturing success stories such as Union Craft, and Hooperwood Mill becomes converted to artist studios, and there's a thriving arts community there as well. And before I wrap up, I just wanted to point out these wayfinding signs. So if you're around Woodberry or along the Jones Falls from Mount Washington down to Mill Number 1, you might come across these signs that tell a little bit about the history of the neighborhood. This was such a pleasure to work on. And on the right here is me and my friend Paula, who did all the great design work with that, and also Megan Bacco, who managed the project and dealt with all of us as we were all the back and forth with all of that. So thank you so much for the opportunity to present. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Nathan. We have a lot of questions, so this is awesome. No, we'll just start it off. Someone asked, what is the history of the name Woodberry?
Of the what Woodberry? Sorry. The
history.
Oh, before that, it was the history of the.
Oh, of the name Woodberry.
Of the name Woodberry. You know, I don't know what the history of the name is. Like and this is just purely conjecture on my part. I think they wanted to have a name that sort of spoke to like a more countryside bucolic type atmosphere, right? That, you know, this wasn't going to be like Manchester in England, right? This is Woodberry, you know, it's like we do factory towns different.
Awesome, awesome. Next is, did any of the workers write about their mill experiences in journals, diaries, etc.?
You know, the best, there have been oral histories of people from who were working in the 1920s. So there's a book about Stone Hill that you can find. That was incredible interviews with workers and who tell their stories. Guy Holiday did those interviews back in the 80s, and so you can find that book on Amazon. It's really worth it to get their perspectives with that. And there's also an oral history project that was done, I think, in the 80s by University of Maryland or University of Baltimore. So you get more of those stories of people living in Hampden. More contemporary of their period was the mill company actually had its own publication that was distributed throughout the neighborhood. So it was all about just like this sort of slice of life, everyday life things that were happening around these mill villages. And I mean, you have to take it with a grain of salt because a lot of it is propaganda, where it's like there's all these articles about like how important it is to be an independent worker. And right, it's like if you get injured on the job, that's like your own fault. Like don't blame us for it. But yeah, I think some of those oral history interviews are really essential.
Awesome. Some of your maps showed quarries. Is there still evidence of these?
Yeah, I think there's still evidence of quarries along the Jones Falls. I think if you look hard enough, you can see the sort of remnants. I'm not very good at that kind of stuff. I'm not really good at reading landscapes. But I think definitely there was lots of mining happening in the Jones Falls Valley. And particularly if you go even further up toward like Mount Washington and Cold Spring area, there was like chromium mining happening there. So yeah, I think we can probably find the scars of that.
And sort of a related question here is Jones Falls an actual waterfall or the name of the entire stream?
Yeah, it's falls is one of those weird sort of like local naming things. Right? It's like it's not a waterfall. It's like it describes that like a particular kind of stream, I think. Because like the Jones Falls, I don't think it's like technically a river, right? It's kind of too small for that, but it's like the Jones Falls sort of falls down the Piedmont Plateau and into the coastal plain. And also a lot of Baltimore's main tributaries are called falls, like Gwynns Falls is another example.
Are there any images and text of the wayfinding signs available online?
There are, yes. If you go to Explore Baltimore Heritage, and there's an entire tour on that page that includes all of the sites and all of the text. Actually has more information, more photos than the actual signs do. We couldn't fit everything we wanted to fit on there. So Explore Baltimore Heritage is the way to go. And you also be able to find the addresses of all these places too.
Awesome. Maybe someone can throw that in the chat. Excuse me. Is Robert Poole's mansion still there?
No, that was torn down in the 1920s. So Robert Poole died in, I think, I might get this wrong, like early 20th century, I think in the 1910s. His family were there for a while, and then it was torn down, and then I think like close to the site of the mansion, the school was built, the Robert Poole School, which is now the Ace Academy.
Awesome.
It's interesting. It's an interesting example of a Second Empire style mansion, which you don't see a whole lot of those types of houses around here.
Did they experience major flooding over the years with the Jones Falls?
Yeah, I didn't touch on that, but that was a major concern. One concern was of course fires. So you working in a factory, you have all this cotton flying around you, easily catches fire. Actually, the Woodberry factory had its own private fire engine, which they got like in the 19th century. But yeah, flooding was another huge issue. With the textile mills, right? I think the losses from those weren't as important as they are today, where it's like, you have like now you have people living in these places. You have like smaller businesses. With the textile mills, it's like they could just like rebuild, resupply. They continued to grow and grow, and didn't really seem to phase them. But some of the manufacturers that came in the middle of the 20th century were really devastated by flooding. One example is the Maryland Nut and Bolt Company. They were in the Mount Washington Mill complex. If you go to Whole Foods, that was one of the Maryland Nut and Bolt buildings. And when Agnes came through, it just destroyed it, and they ended up shutting down and selling the company.
Wow. Okay. Did the factory ownership resist or try to oppose the growth of outside mercantile interests in their towns as it would erode their monopoly and worker dependency?
No, I don't think so. I mean, like in like the Jones Falls Valley, right? Like we talked about Poole and Hunt and the textile mills. So the Poole family and the Hooper family was one of the Mill families were super close, right? Their children married. So like I think there was more like more collaboration, but I haven't seen any evidence of them resisting things, right? What I did see, what like resistance to was in like the late 20th century, like 1960s, like a lot of the companies, the factories that were still there along the Jones Falls were very resistant to some of the ideas of like, there was a master plan for the Jones Falls in the 1960s, and they were really resistant to that and the idea of like, of converting it to more of like a place for residents and things. It was like very much focused on like, this is an industrial area.
Do we have time for a few more?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. What do you see for Woodberry's future?
What do I see for Woodberry's future? That's a good question. So before I moved out of Woodbury to Mount Washington, I was the chair of the Architectural Review Committee there. So, and getting the CHAP district was a huge achievement for the neighborhood and just protecting the history there. Like I said before, like Woodbury is Baltimore's Lower Massachusetts. And when we saw the one of the stone houses torn down a few years ago, like no one thought that could be a possibility, right? Like who in their right mind would tear down like something from an intact mill village? That's just crazy, right? So having that protection in place, I think is really important to the future of development. And I think that we're going to see more development in Woodbury, right? I mean, Woodbury is on the up and up, and like Hampden has been like the place for a while now, but like you pay a Hampden premium, right, to live in Hampden. It's still much cheaper to live in Woodbury. There's nice houses to be bought there. And also the proximity to the light mill is also a very strong asset. So, you know, I think development is going to happen and it should happen in Woodbury, but it should be done in a way that is respectful of the area's past and the importance of that history to understanding Baltimore's industrial past today.
And on a similar note, are there any other historic buildings in the neighborhood that are threatened with demolition or degradation that residents should be aware of?
So that's a good question. I think one building to watch is the tractor building. So I don't know what the future of that is at this point. It was recently sold to another developer. I would say like that's probably the big one to watch to see what happens. And of course, got Baltimore Heritage right here. So you guys are also on top of it too. And I've been such an incredible advocate for historic buildings in the neighborhood.
Awesome. Well, I think maybe, do we have time for one more?
Let's do one more, yeah.
Okay. Let's see. I think I saw an old map in the mill recently that had a canal next to the mill. Was there one?
So there were mill races, right? And depending on what mill you're talking about the Woodberry factory or the mill number one. What I can say is that Clipper Mill Road, which is if you go to Union and turn to Clipper Mill Road, right, that goes by Whitehall Mill and up towards mill number one. That used to be a waterway. So that used to be like a mill race that served, or I think it's actually labeled as a canal on some insurance maps that serviced Whitehall Mill. So there was like a canal that's no longer there that existed. And also there's a mill race that is behind the Poole and Hunt factory. So if you go there today, you can actually see it if you look behind the pool.
And that was where the water that was used to power the mill came from?
Yeah, I mean, with Poole and Hunt, I don't know if they really use it to power much of anything with their operation. But I think like having like a running water source nearby was probably useful for all sorts of other things.
Okay. We got a number of questions about how to see this presentation again. The Baltimore Architecture Foundation will put it on their YouTube channel, and then it's also on their Facebook page and Baltimore Heritage's Facebook page. So you can go ahead and watch it on any of those places. And I think that's it. Thank you again, Nathan. This was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.